Hello everyone, my name is Jessica and I'm a sophomore childhood ed major with a music concentration and a minor in English. Today I'll be discussing the book She of the Mountains by Vivek Shraya. I love this book for so many reasons. This is a skillfully crafted work in which the author discusses many different themes and connects them in ways that I personally thought were so easy to understand and read. If you're looking for a book to help you understand intersectional feminism, this is it. The book uses Hindu mythology, an extremely fascinating subject, to help address elements in an overall real-life love story. Some themes include gender identity, self-image, and the effects of the relationships on both of these. The author, Vivek Shraya, really knows how to sculpt a book. He currently lives in Toronto, Canada, and has created works in the areas of literature, music, and video. He's really done it all. This book is his first novel, and he's been a finalist and a winner of many literary awards, including the Lambda Literary Award and Toronto's Art Foundation Emerging Artist Award. He has another book out currently called God Loves Hair, which is fantastic, and I urge you to check it out if you've already read She of the Mountains. Without further ado, I'd like to hop right into the content of our novel. Gender identity. It can come in so many forms because it is, you guessed it, a spectrum. This is one of the key concepts addressed in She of the Mountains, and the theme that I found occurring over and over again, almost on every page. To give some background, we have a few main Hindu characters. Parvati, the goddess of life, whose name is a rough translation of She of the Mountains, and wife of Shiva, who is known as the Destroyer. And the child of both of these deities is Ganesh. One of the majorly cool parts about the depiction of the two main deities is that they are never portrayed with strictly female or male features. The narrator makes some connections back to this mythology while contemplating his gender identity. Not the first instance of this, but one that struck a chord with me, is that of the story of Ganesh and his brother Muruga on page 73 of this novel. Now, the story of Ganesh is a complicated one. When he was just born by Parvati, Shiva mistakenly cut his head off and tried to fix his mistake by fetching the head of an evil ruler that just so happens to be an elephant, and putting that on his son. He is described as pushing the limits of acceptance by his parents and doesn't seem to fit into the norm in any standard. Yet in this story, he wins the race that his father sets up for him. And when he does so, Shiva honors him and calls him Lord of Lords, and essentially confirms an identity for his son. No longer will Ganesh be perceived as abnormal by anyone inside of the realm of deities or out. This is then connected to the narrator's real-life story of when the female love interest states, "You are a man," in response to the question, "Don't you wish I was more manly?" on page 76 of this novel. This is so extremely important and a key turning point in the character's gender identity. Though the narrator is still yet considering his sexuality, his deeper reflection of his sexuality insinuates a more profound knowledge based on what he perceives his gender as. A performative aspect, gender is seen throughout this novel as something the narrator announces, such as the statement, "I now pronounce you blah blah blah." Gender becomes almost this sort of verb that the narrator can enact. Another aspect of this book is the idea of the word queer being reclaimed by the author. To quote from page 107 of this novel, "Queer encompassed every time his gender was read as wrong, allowed him to shed the sense that he was lying to one group or another." I didn't read this as an act of creating awareness for biphobia. I did see this as a key element of the plot and of the character's overall progression towards his real self. In the case of this advocating against biphobia, there is a widely spread belief that being bisexual is not a true identity, that one is either gay or straight, and that anything in between is just a temporary position. The author is extremely alarmed by this because though most people put the label gay on him, he feels attraction towards a woman. Here, the word queer is an excellent example of an identity defined for himself. The word queer itself is defined as strange or odd, and to label oneself as such, it tends to set one outside of the binary and into a nice gray area. Relating this back to Hindu mythology, before the long stretch of real stories that the narrator tells us in which he proclaims a queer identity, he speaks of Sati. Here, I believe the narrator is trying to project himself as Sati. Sati, an incarnation of Parvati, was mortal and not a god. Shiv begins to chase Sati and almost forgets Parvati's existence. Now, what I find interesting here is the last line of this myth, in which he says, "I needed to know what it would be like to lose you." This created such an instant parallel to the following story that it blew my mind. The two characters fight and fight and fight, and to what end? At the end of the chapter, they are loving each other for over 5 years, and I feel, in part, it is because the narrator has chosen an identity. Before, when there was Sati and Parvati, Shiv felt that he could only love one or the other. When Parvati was simply Parvati, Shiv sat back and said that he would needed to wait and see what it would be like to have, one of them not around. By solidifying her identity, Parvati is much like the narrator, and that is how the love story is eventually solidified in both cases. All excellent examples of gender and gender theory as a performative action, this novel sure knows how to create a fantastic literary connection and make the reader think. With that being said, let's hop right into my other theme of self-image that I found so prevalent throughout the novel. Now, whether or not you struggle with self-image, or whether you find it a topic of interest, this novel does an excellent job of looking at things that lie under the surface that no one sees or notices. If we look towards the middle of the novel, on page 57, we see a section in which the narrator's mother hates his weight. The words fat and failure were synonymous to her. Creatively, yet again, the narrator makes a connection to Ganesh. Ganesh's head was that of a villain who had become greedy, claiming more and more land as his own, as the novel states. And this parasitic and ever-expanding nature can be almost directly related to gaining weight or gaining more space. In both stories, a parental figure seems to shed an air of disgrace over this idea and shame their children for this aspect. Shreya, in a discussion, said he wanted to make this book about relationships to others versus relationships to self. One of the primary reasons why I believe this book is titled She of the Mountains is because of Parvati's name and the connection that the narrator continually makes towards the character of Parvati. A very poetic beginning and end, showing a connection between a narrator's experience and Parvati's stories. The beginning starts, "In the beginning, there is no he, there is no she. Life begets life. We are the period to a sentence, the effect to a cause, always belonging to someone. We are never our own. This is why we are so lonely." Not only is this a beautifully depicted scene, but it ties into so many themes throughout the novel. Self-image comes in as the author travels through these sentences of trying to be part of the gay community, of trying to please his mother with how he looks, and trying to find the right partner. Parvati is the bringer of life. She has her own form and her own identity. Not once is she described as not knowing exactly who she is. And by the end of the novel, the last section states, "For millennia, I have been evolving into this version of myself, this body, to know yours, because it was necessary." This poignant statement is not just extremely romantic, but full of self-efficacy. Through telling the Hindu myths alongside his own real stories, the narrator develops such a personal and active sense of self. It becomes this fluid sense of self, portrays a very confident self-image, and that he decides who he is, and that he needs not to define himself around his relationships with others, but rather for the purpose of knowing another. This portrayal of self-image is inspiring and awe-inducing. It shakes the whole purpose of the novel, allowing the narrator to be bisexual, allowing him to perform gender the way he wishes, and giving him a healthier concept of what his relationships should look like. Overall, this book is a great piece of literature. It is so important for all readers to take this book for its full potential. Through all of these themes, I now have a greater understanding of gender identity, especially, but also of biphobia and how relationships with families can affect a person's self-identity. The new wave type connection of very modern issues, in context of course, because these things have been around forever, to very ancient texts and stories bring a sense of groundedness to what many people today think as simply a new wave thing, a trend. Anyone who enjoys literature with deep connections and a profound literary experience should read this novel. I don't think there's a part of this novel that was problematic, though I wasn't a fan of the overuse of sexual acts. However, even the use of this wasn't bad, as the narrator was literally finding their way through being comfortable with their bodies and identities and with a sex as a whole, so it's fine. So even that tiny problematic part turned out to be non-problematic. This is a fantastic novel, and even if you aren't an advocate or part of the Moji community, or anyone who is familiar with queer theory or gender theory, you can pick it up and read it and really enjoy it for what it is. To conclude, She of the Mountains is on the top of my book recommendation list and will probably remain up there for a while. For a good story, go check it out. Thanks for watching! A very poetic